Good evening, guys, gals, ghouls, and goblins. As you all know, Halloween is just around the corner, and I could not pass up on the chance to give you guys, you lovely listeners, a special Void Frequency Halloween episode. Now, to be fair, I did have like 5 or 6 special episodes lined up for this month, and they would each have these specific themes and like a scary story at the end of each one, and I was like super pumped for it. I was like ready to go. And, it's been quite some time since I uploaded. It just would have been a cool thing to pump out a bunch of these episodes for you guys. Unfortunately, I kind of bit off a little bit more than I could chew with this. And I didn't realize just how busy October was going to be for me. Before I knew it, the last week of October was pretty quickly approaching, and I hadn't even started doing my research. So I had to kind of restrict myself to this one special. But this doesn't mean we can't enjoy this one. So the way I've set this episode up is I've taken some interesting stories and some facts from each classic Halloween horror icon. So like werewolves and vampires, ghosts, witches, and the like. And I put them all into one big ol' Halloween extravaganza. So without further ado, let's move into the chilling tales and accounts of this terrifying Halloween special. Werewolves are often described as these mythical creatures, typically some person who turns into a fearsome wolf-like creature under the full moon. This transformation varies from legend to legend. Some people say that werewolves shift into a gruesome man-wolf hybrid, while others say that the transformation is just into either an unusually large or just a normal-sized wolf. You see all kinds of different variations, both folklore and also just like your modern monster movies or whatever. But do not fear, there are all kinds of signs to detect a werewolf, including but not limited to having a unibrow, having hairy palms, having a scar-like symbol in the shape of a pentagram usually on the hand or chest, having an index finger longer than the middle finger. Hold up. Okay, I had to check that one for a second. Hair on the inside of the skin, which was one of the ways that they would check for werewolves during like the werewolf witch trial things, which is like really painful if you think about it. Like hair on the inside of the skin, like a love of rare or raw meat, which oof, they got me on that one. I love rare meat. But their eyes will also reflect in the darkness, much like a dog's. Like if you shine a flashlight at like a dog's eyes, it'll shine and shit. An obsession with wandering the graveyards at night. So your average Hot Topic shopper. Dry tongue and eyes, excessive thirst, ulcers and abrasions on the arms and legs from walking on all fours, random bruises and scrapes after waking up, and weak vision. So there you have it. I have officially prepared you to spot any werewolf that crosses your path. So, funnily enough, I actually knew a lot about these when I was a little kid because I like went through this really big like werewolf monster phase. And like I had this book about like all these different signs on like how to spot a werewolf or a vampire or whatnot. And like as I read them, I had this weird like placebo effect. Like I would read it and be like, "Oh God, I get thirsty sometimes," or like, "Oh no, I have dry tongue and eyes." Like, you know what I mean? Like I would like convince myself that I had those or whatever. But anyway, now that we've got all the official info out of the way, let's get into our stories. So our first story takes place in Wittlich, Germany. Sightings of werewolves in the town of Wittlich, Germany have gone on for hundreds of years, and there was one werewolf story in particular that really put the fear of the full moon into these villagers. The werewolf in question is famously known as the Moorbach monster and is believed to be a real werewolf local to that area. So the stories and local legends of the Moorbach monster say that the story goes back to this deserter from Napoleon's army. And this guy's fleeing with a group of Russians, and they go through the town of Wittlich in Germany. And while he's here, one of this deserter, this soldier, Thomas Johannes Baptist Schweitzer, what a mouthful, he attacks and kills a farmer and the farmer's wife. But before he kills the wife has enough time to curse this guy. She, says that he's going to become a werewolf on the night of each full moon. And so, around the time this werewolf is spotted in the countryside, it's evil, it's vicious, it attacks people, nonstop. And eventually the villagers find him, capture him, and destroy him, and they set up a shrine at the site with a lit candle that they burn on the night of each full moon. And legend holds that as long as the candle burns, the werewolf will not return. So kind of like a Hocus Pocus Sanderson sisters deal, like the black candle. So fast forward to 1988, where a group of U.S. military men are stationed at nearby Moorbach U.S. Air Force Base in Germany. They know of the legend and that there's always a candle lit on the shrine of the night of the full moon. Well, one night they're coming back from the town of Wittlich. They're walking along, and they see that the candle on the shrine has burned out. And so they joke around about it. They're trying to scare each other with the legend or whatever. But to their surprise, however, that same night, a large creature that resembles an upright wolf is spotted by security forces, or military police at the time. When they go out searching, the military working dog clearly smells something and signals, but absolutely refuses to pursue whatever it's found. Many believe that the coincidences are just too great, and that the creature that was spotted by the military working dogs and security forces that night was the infamous werewolf, the Moorbach monster. Our next story takes place in Palmyra, Maine. I have to be honest, I chose this one because it's pretty creepy, but also because I grew up in Palmyra, Indiana, so I'm a little biased. Like, it's still a scary story, but let's get into this family's chilling account. Due to a pretty nasty work-related injury on the father's part, the Martin family was looking for a nice, calm house in the countryside. So the mother, Shelley, had found this beautiful older farm in Palmyra that was just what they needed. It was surrounded by these dense woods. Eric, the father, had always been really big into hunting and had this fairly extensive collection of guns. Shelley wasn't a huge fan of it, but, because of this, she had him lock them up. So with the help of Eric's son, Sean, Eric built a strong box to hold the guns under lock and key inside the barn. So Eric and Shelley had a routine of having evening coffee out on their porch, provided it wasn't going to be too cold. So one night, while they were having their coffee, they noticed these strange pulsating lights out past the tree line. And at first, Sean thought it was just a poacher with a flashlight, but something didn't seem right. Shelley thought that these lights were unnatural, and Eric and Sean headed out into the field to investigate. As they approached the woods, the lights went out. It was so quiet, the snap of a tree branch underfoot echoed across the forest. Eric sent Sean around with his flashlight off, hoping to catch any potential poacher unaware. Eric felt something far beyond any fear he'd ever felt while he was hunting, almost as if the hunter had become the prey. But all Eric and Sean found was each other, not even a track on the ground to give them a hint of what they'd seen. Chelsea, however, was the daughter of the family, and one day her boyfriend Nathan came for a visit, and they decided to go for a walk in the woods with the dogs. The dogs ran out ahead of them, catching a scent. When Chelsea and Nathan caught up, the dogs were rooting around by a large hole in the ground. Nathan thought the overly round hole had been dug with care, meticulously. Chelsea had a bad feeling about the whole thing, and so she urges him to leave, and they both agree to go. Fast forward to Memorial Day weekend, and Shelley was making the evening coffee as usual. Something wasn't right, however. The dogs didn't want to go outside to their pen. Eric noticed that it was particularly quiet on that misty evening. When Eric heard an odd sound in the distance, he knew there was some sort of danger out there. So Eric begins to usher Shelley into the house. She begins to protest, but then there's the rustling of leaves. As the husband and wife looked out into the distance, they saw 5 sets of gleaming eyes watching them. With little left to be said, they rushed into the house and locked the door. From what Eric had seen, he knew it wasn't a bear, but it was large and seemed very dangerous. The guns were out in the barn, and Eric wasn't sure his family was going to be safe in the house. So Eric needed to get to his guns, but Shelley told him to stay in the house. She went up to Chelsea's room and woke up her daughter. Chelsea was half awake when she looked out the window, but laid back down and went back to sleep. But as Shelley looked out the window, she saw what she described as all 5 of the creatures still there. One stood on its hind legs and looked right at Shelley. Eric felt an instinct to protect his family. With the creatures in the distance, he thought that he might be able to get the family car backed up close enough to get them out. Even with his injury, Eric goes outside. Shelley went through the house, closing all the windows, and she finally found the family's 2 hunting dogs hiding in a shadowed corner. If the dogs were scared, what was out there? When Eric finally reached the porch, he realized that he might have the distance to get there. It was going to be the longest 20 feet of his life. He started to slowly walk toward the car. When he finally reached it, grabbing the keys and trying to unlock the door, the motion sensor lights popped on. Eric was frightened and very vulnerable, and as he turned to open the door, he came face to face with one of the creatures. It tried to reach into the light, but something stopped it. It bolted off into the darkness. Eric made for the house as quickly as he could. So they decided to call the police, hoping for someone else to drive in while they remained sheltered. The police, however, didn't take them seriously, telling Shelley to just close the windows and lock the doors. Nobody was coming for them. They were on their own. So Shelley set up a view from Chelsea's window. She could see the whole farm from there. Eric was downstairs, frustrated and upset. Then it occurred to him that the creatures were either afraid of or hurt by the light. That had to be why they didn't attack him. So he made the decision to use that light to get out to the barn and fetch a gun. He went outside, flailing his arms in a desperate attempt to trigger the motion sensor. When the light came on, Eric realized that the eyes were staring back at him, surrounding him. Eric was being hunted. He had to get back into the house. He got back as quickly as he could, barely making it before the lights went out. Shelley was the one to hear them approach. They were on the other side of the outside wall, and if they wanted in, they were going to get in. Her family was being held hostage in their own house by these creatures. They weren't able to get to the guns. There weren't any police coming. What were they going to do? Grabbing every sharp instrument they could find, Shelley went and woke Chelsea. They needed all hands awake and alert. They all went into the master bedroom and laid on top of the bed, armed, waiting on daylight to come. When they heard the creatures outside, they were petrified. The only thing between the Martins and the creatures was the bedroom window. When the morning sun finally came up, the whole Martin family breathed a sigh of relief. The creatures were gone. Eric called Sean, who came over and helped look for tracks. The tracks they did find were huge, with enormous claws, easily some kind of predator. But this wasn't the strangest find. The spacing of the tracks, the distance between each step, all signs pointed towards one terrifying conclusion. The creatures were walking on two legs. So, what did you all think of my werewolf stories, eh? Pretty spooky. But we've covered one creature of the night. We still have one more to go. It's time to move on to our next dark predator. Vampires are possibly one of the most popular horror icons. They are often depicted and described as the reanimated body of a dead person believed to come from the grave at night to feed on the blood of the living. Interestingly enough, stories and tales of vampires aren't just a fun story to tell around Halloween or some cheap flick where Robert Pattinson shows off his glittering pecs. Tales and myths of vampires can be found all over Europe and other countries. And a lot of villagers actually feared these creatures so much that they would go on these vampire hunts, where they would exhume the dead bodies of suspected vampires and take certain measures to ensure that the bloodsucker couldn't come back to feed on the innocent people of the town. But first, you have to identify a vampire. Some of these methods got really weird. One of them is literally to put a 7-year-old boy on a white horse, let them ride through a graveyard at night, and whichever grave the horse stops next to is supposed to be the vampire. So so many of these old rituals are so long and drawn out and specific that you can't help but believe it. When a story you tell is so outlandish and detailed that there's no way it can be fabricated. But anyway, there are a lot more simple ways of identifying your average bloodsucker. According to a lot of vampire folklore, vampires display some telltale physical signs of their ghastly affliction: pale skin and absence of reflection in mirrors, fangs and red glowing eyes. These are all attributes we are pretty familiar with. Despite their monstrous descriptions throughout history, a lot of doctors believe that there may have been a more medical explanation for the spread of vampire stories throughout Europe. A disease known as porphyria, also known as the Dracula disease. It was pretty widespread among the aristocracy. Patients were very sensitive to light, developed brownish teeth, and had these skin lesions, and they were often told to drink blood from other people to replenish their own, which is really fucking weird. But the most damning form of evidence for these frightened villagers was digging up the body and discovering the body with no decomposition and blood forming around the corners of the mouth, almost as if the corpse had been feeding recently. This was typically enough to convince anyone that a vampire was terrorizing their village. Now, typically, the act of stopping the vampire, killing the vampire, was accomplished by pinning the vampire to the earth with a wooden stake through the chest. Pretty familiar, pretty standard stuff. A lot of people know that as like the way to kill vampires. But also, sometimes they would put garlic or a large stone or like a brick in the mouth of the vampire to keep them from like getting out, I guess, because like the brick's in their mouth so they can't bite down. I don't know. Or you could just cut their head off. Decapitating vampires is a good way of taking them down. But anyway, so I was doing my research, right, and I came across some really weird info. So put on your tinfoil hats real quick, because it's conspiracy time. So apparently, Karl Marx knew about vampires. Yeah, that's right. Karl Marx. Father of communism. In his famous book, Capital, he said that capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor that it sucks. Elsewhere in Capital, he also wrote of the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor, and explained that the vampire will not lose its hold so long as there is a muscle, a nerve, a drop of blood to be exploited. So he's constantly using this comparison of capitalism to these vampires feeding on the living blood of the laborious, right? Which, like, could just be him using his imagination to draw this comparison between these vampires feeding on the hard work and lifeblood of the working class. But he also mentioned in one of his writings his interaction with a boyar, which is like a noble, a boyar, which is like a noble from Wallachia. And he refers to him as vampire-like, as if he were Vlad Tepes, the Impaler himself, Count Dracula, shit like that. But, story time, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar with horror literature, the book Dracula was written by Bram Stoker. It's the story of Count Dracula, or Vlad Tepes, who is this warlord of Wallachia. So it's interesting that Karl would make this comparison between a Wallachian noble and the infamous Vlad Dracula. So, cute little coincidence, right? Here's the weird thing. Karl Marx passed away in 1883. Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897, 14 years after his death. So, did Karl Marx know something that we didn't? Did he have some underground, like, communist vampire hunters guild? There's no telling, but it's definitely creepy. Or coincidental, your choice. But with all my cool conspiracy stuff out of the way, let me give you the story of one of the most infamous true vampire stories. Our tale starts in Exeter, Rhode Island, where several members of George and Mary Brown's family suffered a sequence of tuberculosis infections in the final 2 decades of the 19th century. Tuberculosis was pretty bad at the time. Well, I mean, it's bad all the time, but it was hitting particularly hard at this point. It was being called consumption at the time and was super devastating, and a lot of people were scared of it, obviously. But the mother, Mary Eliza, was the first to die of the disease, followed in 1886 by their eldest daughter, Mary Olive. So in 1891, the daughter Mercy and son Edwin also contracted the disease. Friends and neighbors of the family believed that one of the dead family members was a vampire, although they did not use that name, but it was something similar. But they believed that this vampire was causing Edwin's illness. So this was in accordance with a bunch of contemporary folklore from around the area, which linked multiple deaths in one family to undead activity. And tuberculosis was already really poorly understood at the time, and so a lot of people turned to superstition to explain it. So George Brown was persuaded to give permission to exhume several bodies of his family members, right? So villagers, the local doctor, and a newspaper reporter exhumed the bodies on March 17th, 1892. The bodies of both Mary and Mary Olive were dug up, and their coffins were opened. Inside were the 2 decomposing corpses of Mary and Mary Olive. Everything was normal as far as burials go, and so they set their sights on the next member of the family, Mercy Brown. So they dug away at her gravesite and pulled back the lid of their coffin, but to their confusion and horror, Mercy's body lay inside, showing no signs of decomposition, and weirder still, they found that her heart still contained blood within it. This was taken as a sign that the young woman was indeed a creature of darkness and had caused Edwin's condition. So as superstition dictated, Mercy's heart and liver were burned, and the ashes were mixed with water to create a tonic and was given to the sick Edwin to drink, as an effort to try and, resolve his illness and stop the influence of the undead. Unfortunately, the young man died 2 short months later, and what remained of Mercy's body was buried in the cemetery of the Baptist Church in Exeter after being desecrated. So while this story is really famous and gained a lot of traction in pop culture, and as you all know, I'm pretty quick to want to believe in the paranormal, I really just can't buy into this one. Like, literally, the reason she hadn't decomposed is because her body was being kept in freezing conditions in an above-ground crypt during the 2 months following her death. So, obviously, the cold was just preserving her body. You see it all the time. People who get trapped up on Everest and freeze to death are, like, perfectly preserved when people, finally find them, despite being dead for weeks or months, etc. And young Edwin, bless his little soul, is dead because he was sick with TB and then drank his sister's fucking liver heart ash water, and it probably, fucked him all up. There's no telling what the fuck that did to him. So, sorry, you guys, but vampire story, debunked. Done. I still don't know about the Karl Marx thing, though. That's probably real. Karl Marx is a vampire slayer. Easy. But real-life vampires have shown throughout history and even today. So when I say real vampires, I'm not talking real vampires. I'm talking real-life accounts of a serial killer ingesting the blood of their victims. So you have Peter Curtin, the Dusseldorf Monster, Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, and even Tsutomu Miyazaki, or the Little Girl Killer. Like, these are all real serial killers who are known to drink the blood and eat the victims that they murdered. I didn't include them in this story because there's just so much on them, and I'd like to do a full-length episode on all of them, or just like each of them in season 2, so stay tuned for that. But not only that, there are also people nowadays who identify as like vampires and drink blood. Now granted, it's from like willing donors and shit. They're not going full Dracula on, Karen walking down the street. They're just everyday folks who drink blood as a hobby, or like as, whatever, not a hobby, I guess. I don't know. I saw a documentary once on this, and there was like this guy. I remember this really vividly. It was like a Nat Geo Halloween special vampire episode or whatever. And I remember watching this as a kid. And this guy, like, was like what you would expect a stereotypical vampire to look like. He had like this long, straight black hair that went down to like his shoulders. And he had like the fangs in and shit. And he's like super pale. And he's like got like a black button up with like the top 2 buttons undone. So it's just like bare chest exposed. And he's like, yeah, Saturdays my girlfriend comes over and we just, she's a nurse, so we just siphon some blood out of that vein and I get my fucking drink on. Like, it was just really weird to watch, like his wife come over, or like his girlfriend or whatever come over, and she's like, sticking her own fucking needle in her arm and draining it into a wine glass, and he's just like, thanks, sweetie, and like kiss her on the cheek as he's like downing a glass. Like I don't know, you do you, I guess, as long as you're not fucking hurting anybody, but. Anyway, we are now finished with vampires. We can move on to our next ghoulish entity of Halloween fright. Witches, servants of Satan and abomination in the eyes of the Lord our God. Amen. All joking aside, we're gonna talk about witches next. This segment is going to be a little less creepy and a little bit more interesting, more factual. Sorry, flip through to the next section if you're not super into this. But anyway, on to what I was saying. Witches have been around for a while. The earliest records of a witch is in the Bible, in the book of like 1 Samuel or Samuel the First or whatever. And this book was thought to be written about between 931 BC or 721 BC, somewhere in there. And it tells the story of this guy, King Saul, and he seeks out this witch of Endor. No, we're not talking about the Ewok moon in Star Wars. It's just some witch from some place. So he asks her to summon this dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help him defeat the Philistine army. Of course, later in the story, the witch also prophesies that Saul and his sons are going to die. And when his sons do die, the next day Saul takes his own life. So yeah, good things, bad things. But anyway, mention of them in early cultures and civilizations is pretty prevalent. In other cultures, these witches were people who were believed to practice some form of magic, using like spells and charms, and even calling upon spirits for help or to bring about change. And it wasn't until Christianity started to become more prevalent in the Middle Ages that witches were seen as servants of Satan. Witch hysteria became really rampant. Many accused witches ended up confessing, usually under torture, to a variety of these wicked behaviors. And within a century, witch hunts were common, and most of the accused were executed by hanging, or decapitation, sometimes burning at the stake. Single women, widows, and other women on the margins of society that weren't, your stereotypical, ladylike, whatever, were usually targeted, which is really fucked. I know in later accounts, like Salem, that men were targeted too, but, the larger majority, when I say, larger majority, I'm talking, 80, 90% larger, but the larger majority was women, and most of these women were, healers and wise women who were just really good with herbs and natural medicines to cure shit, say, the common cold. So, that's fucked. Between the years 1500 and 1660, up to 80,000 suspected witches were put to death in Europe. All of them were thought to be in cahoots with the devil and filled with lust, and Germany actually ended up having the highest witchcraft execution rate, while Ireland had the lowest, which I think has to do with the fact that Ireland's, steeped in, Celtic culture, and, witches are, pretty prevalent in Celtic mythology and culture, and it's not seen as a bad thing. So that's kind of my hypothesis on that. But around this time, a book gets written, right? It's called the Malleus Maleficarum. I feel like I butchered that. Malleus Malefic. I feel like it's Malleus Maleficarum, but fuck it. Anyway, these two German Dominicans wrote about it in 1486, and this book translates to The Hammer of Witches. It was essentially a guide on how to identify, hunt, and interrogate witches. So it's basically Ned's Declassified, but for fucking killing witches and shit. So anyway, Malleus Maleficarum said witchcraft was an affront to God and that it was heresy, and it was just fucking awful, terrible, just despicable shit. And quickly became the end-all, be-all rulebook for these Protestants and Catholics trying to flesh out witches living among them. So for more than 100 years, the book sold more copies of any other book in Europe, except the Bible, which is a big accomplishment, I guess. But also, realistically, how many people were reading back then? Were reading at the time? It probably would have just been nobles and the middle class, upper crust, feudalism. You know what I mean? How many books were around the time as well anyway? But I don't know. Still a big deal, I guess. So over the years, witch fever starts dying out in Europe. So as it goes away in the old world, it kind of starts to grow in the new world. So you got Salem, right? And it's just all over the place between wars between the French and the British. And you got smallpox. You got the ever-present threat of Native American tribes. And this tense atmosphere was just was prime, was quality real estate for finding some fucking scapegoats. So now you have the Salem witch trials. Now, once again, as with pretty much everything on this, I won't go super in depth on the Salem witch trials since, I would like to do a longer standalone episode on it. But anyway, the Salem witch trials began when this 9-year-old girl, Elizabeth Parris, and 11-year-old girl, Abigail Williams, began suffering from these fits, body contortions, and this uncontrolled screaming, right? They're just freaking the fuck out. And as more young women begin to exhibit these symptoms, mass hysteria just breaks out. Everyone's flipping the fuck out. They're losing their fucking minds. And these 3 women are accused of witchcraft. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Tituba is this enslaved woman owned by Paris's father. So Tituba confesses to being a witch and began accusing others of using black magic. And so on June 10th, Bridget Bishop became the first accused witch to be put to death during the Salem witch trials, where she was hanged at the Salem gallows. Ultimately, around 150 people were accused and 18 were put to death. And women weren't the only victims of the Salem witch trials. 6 men were also convicted and executed, but like I said earlier, of 18 put to death, 6 were men, so women still the majority here. And they still targeted women that were that didn't act exactly as the Bible or God told them to, so there's that. But Massachusetts wasn't the first of the 13 colonies to obsess about witches, though, because in Windsor, Connecticut in 1647, Alcee Young was the first person in America executed for witchcraft. Before Connecticut's final witch trial took place in 1697, 46 people were accused of witchcraft in that state, and 11 were put to death for the crime. But in Virginia, people were way less frantic about witches. In fact, I think it's in Lower Norfolk County. There was a law or something that's like, it's like a crime to falsely accuse someone of witchcraft. So like imagine like having that on your fucking record. Like, you know, like, oh, what are you in for? Oh, I falsely accused someone of being a witch. Like, oh, it happens, you know, down here in Norfolk County. But, you know, witchcraft was still probably a concern right there. I think it's like 24 witch trials were in Virginia, somewhere between like 1626 and 1730. But interestingly enough, none of the accused were executed, so like they all got off the hook. Anyway, which is interesting that like Virginia wasn't really frantic about witches when one of the most famous witch stories comes from Virginia. So there's this lady named Grace Sherwood, right? And her neighbors accuse her of killing their pigs and hexing their cotton. And a bunch of other accusations follow, and accusations follow, and Grace was brought to trial in 1706. So the court decides to use this controversial water test to determine her guilt or innocence. Sherwood's arms and legs were bound, and she was going to be thrown into a body of water, like a rock, whatever, like tied to her, you know. And it was thought that if she would sink, she was innocent, but if she floated, she was guilty, right? Well, you see this all the time, like in witch movies and shit. I think there's actually like a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode where they do the same thing to Marge, where they like push her over a cliff or some shit, and they're like, yeah, if you fall to your death, you're innocent. So it's like a kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But surprisingly, Grace Sherwood didn't sink and was convicted of being a witch. But once again, with Virginia, she wasn't killed, but she was put in prison for 8 years. Another really famous witch, quotation marks, was Mother Shipton. She was feared and highly regarded as this English prophetess, right? And she was born to a mother who was also suspected of being a witch, so kind of like apple don't far fall from the tree. But Mother Shipton was described as hideously ugly and disfigured, so much so that the locals called her hag face, which is like really fucked up. Like, and a lot of people believed that she was like the daughter of the devil, like her dad was the devil, daddy devil. But despite her unfortunate appearance, she was said to have been England's greatest clairvoyant, which means like being able to like foresee the future and like find lost things. Fuck, I'm thinking of Skyrim. Anyway, so like seeing the future, I think. And was often compared to Nostradamus. So, like, there's that. Like, she's basically female Nostradamus, which is really, you know, fuck it. She's her own thing. But she's a lot like Nostradamus. But according to legend, she had predicted the Spanish Armada, the Great Plague of London, the Great Fire of London, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and some even speculate that she knew about the internet. Because she was quoted one time about saying, like, around the world thoughts shall fly in the twinkling of an eye. Like, so a lot of people were like, fuck, she predicted the internet. I wonder if she predicted Corona. But thankfully for her sake, Mother Shipton did not die by the sword or hanging or burning like other witches. Instead, she just died a normal death and is said to have been buried on unholy ground on the outer edges of York around like 1561. Which is still upsetting. Mary Shipton deserved better. Hashtag Mama Shipton deserved better. But next story. Our final tale is slightly more tragic. We have Malin Matsdotter. I feel like I said that one wrong too. Sorry. But she was a Swedish widow of Finnish descent who was accused by her own daughters of being a witch. Ouch. But in this case, there was no sorcery involved. Instead, the daughters' charge was that she abducted their children and took them to a satanic Sabbath. Malin, along with Anna Simon's daughter, Hack, were the last victims executed for being witches during the Great Swedish Witch Hunt of 1668 through 76, often referred to as the Great Noise. But what makes Malin Matsdotter unique is that she's considered the only witch in Swedish history to have been burned alive. So normally witches were decapitated or hanged to death before their bodies were burned at the stake. It's a common misconception in all witch movies. You see people being burned at the stake and shit, when it, in all actuality, was pretty rare. it just took longer and was kind of needless suffering, which not that they really gave a shit, but a lot of times they either just decapitated him or hung him. But it appears that Malin's refusal to admit to her guilt made the authorities burn her. So yeah, like after all like this torture and shit, they're trying to, fucking squeeze a confession out of her because that's how all witch trials go. Malin apparently the whole time was like, no, fuck it. Like I'm not a witch. I'm not whatever. And the authorities got pissed about it. So unlike her fellow deathmate Anna, who humbly asked for forgiveness, Malin firmly maintained her innocence. And her going out made history because in the end, she refused to shake hands with her daughters, like refused to like make amends. And in the end, as she was being burned, one of them called out for her to repent. They're sitting here begging for her to, reject the devil and please, mother, you must be saved in God's grace. And she literally cursed. She cursed them as like the flames are eating up her body. She gave her daughter into the hands of the devil and cursed her for eternity. And as the flames covered her body, she reportedly did not scream, nor did she appear to be in pain. She didn't make a sound. And for the locals, this was further proof she was a witch, but for me, it means she's a fucking champ. Like, first your daughters accuse you of witchcraft, then despite all the torture and pain, you never confess, then when the authorities decide to fucking burn you alive, and your daughters are sitting there begging you to repent, you make no cries of pain, no screams of agony, you just damn and condemn your daughters to the fiery pits of hell. That right there is fucking metal. And while these stories are interesting to hear about, it's still very unfortunate that so many innocent people, men and women, lost their lives to this witch hysteria. And I'm thankful that the witches of today don't have to deal with that. Like, I've actually met a lot of people who practice modern day Wicca, and they're super nice people with a great outlook on life. And I feel like, even though most of the people who were accused of witchcraft weren't actually witches, like, I feel like the witchcraft of before was still just as simple and, like, reverence for nature and shit like that. So it's just upsetting to see so many witches get a bad rap. But now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to our last spine-tingling subject. You may want to turn on the lights for this one. Phantoms, specters, spirits that still walk this earth, bound to their ethereal form. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to finish out the night by talking about ghosts. Ghosts are described as the souls or spirits of dead people or animals that can appear to the living. In ghost folklore, descriptions of ghosts vary widely, from an invisible presence to translucent or barely visible wispy shades, to realistic lifelike forms. And the belief in the existence of an afterlife, as well as manifestations of the spirits of the dead, super widespread. You find it all over. In certain religious practices, like funeral rites, exorcisms, and some practices of spiritualism and ritual magic, are specifically designed to rest the spirits of the dead. So ghosts are often described as these solitary, human-like essences. And those stories of ghostly armies and the ghosts of animals rather than just humans have also been recounted. They're believed to haunt particular locations, objects, or people that they were associated with in life. So ghosts can take so many different forms, right? And 18% of Americans say that they've seen a ghost, and 45% believe in the existence of ghosts. And there's these different classifications of ghosts, so there's not just like one kind. You have plenty of them, so we're going to go over those. First, you have what is commonly referred to as a personality ghost. This is the most common of all ghosts spotted. It's usually of a deceased person, someone you know, a family member, or historical figure in rare cases. But these ghosts can be friendly, unfriendly, but they often show themselves to others in a variety of different ways. They can become visible, they can speak or make noises, touch you, or even emit an odor like perfume or cigar smoke, something that was tied to them as a person that you would remember. Experts say that this type of ghost retains its former personality of when they were alive and can feel emotions, and often they're visiting you to comfort you or let you know something important. So if you happen to see a lost loved one, chances are they're there because they feel you want or need to see them. And so a lot of people that describe like being in their home and smelling a familiar odor, like I said, like having somebody that smokes, having somebody like in your family that smoked a lot and passed away. Some people say that, like, despite not smoking at all. Like they'll be in their house and they'll suddenly smell like wafts of like cigar smoke or cigarette smoke. And so some people believe that that's a ghost visiting their, living family member. But next we have ectoplasm, which is pretty popular, I feel. It's like a mist or a fog that almost appears like it's swirling. It's sometimes called ectomist or ghostly mist, and these vaporous clouds usually appear several feet off the ground and can move swiftly or simply stay still, almost kind of like it's orbiting around something. And these ghostly encounters have been captured on many videos and in photographs. They can be white, gray, black, sometimes appearing light blue. Although they can simply appear this way, linger, and then move away. But sometimes ectoplasms appear before becoming a full-bodied apparition. And many people have witnessed them outdoors, in graveyards, around battlefields, and these historical sites. Next, we have a very popular one. Like, if you've ever seen any Paranormal Activity movie, you know what this is. Poltergeist. This is one of the most popular terms people have heard of when it comes to ghosts. The word poltergeist is German, I believe. It means noisy ghost. Because it's said to have the ability to move or knock things over, make noise, manipulate the physical environment. And while many of us have heard the term before, poltergeist is actually one of the rarest forms of hauntings, and to many, obviously the most terrifying. Loud knocking sounds, lights turning on and off, doors slamming, and even fires breaking out mysteriously have all been attributed to this type of spiritual disturbance. Another frightening aspect of the poltergeist is that the event usually starts out slowly and mildly, and then begins to intensify as the days go on. And while many times poltergeist activity is harmless and ends quickly, they have been known to actually become dangerous. And some experts explain it as a mass form of energy that a living person is controlling unknowingly. And what's next? Oh, orbs. Orbs are probably the most photographed type of anomaly. This is the one that everybody catches pictures on their iPhones or their cameras, and they're taking pictures in old houses or at graveyards. They appear as a transparent or translucent ball of light that is hovering over the ground, and it's believed that the orbs are the soul of a human or even an animal that's died and is traveling around from one place to another. The circular shape they take on makes it easier for them to move around, and is often the first state they appear in before they become a full-bodied apparition, like a full manifested apparition. So if you're lucky enough to capture an orb on video, they move really fast. In photographs, they're usually white, but like I said before, it can appear gray or like light blue. Interestingly enough, I feel like there's a lot of pictures, because a lot of my family like lives in older houses. I feel like in a lot of pictures, I remember there being a lot of pictures in our houses that have orbs and stuff, either behind the family or around the family. So creepy stuff. And our last ghost is funnel ghosts. Now, these are most often spotted in homes or old historical buildings. The funnel ghost is frequently associated with the cold spots. When people go through it and they're like, oh, I got a chill, or oh, I found a cold spot, like a haunted house or something. It's usually because of a funnel ghost. They usually take on the shape of like a swirling funnel, hence the name. And most paranormal experts believe that they are a loved one returning for a visit, or even a former resident of the home, appearing as a wisp of light or a swirling spiral of light. And they are often caught in photographs or on video, just like the orbs and the ectoplasm or ectomist. So now that we know the types of ghosts, I'm just going to tell some pretty creepy real-life accounts of hauntings, ghostly encounters, and other spooky stuff. And then after that, I'll give you 2 examples of ghosts in my real life. So that'll be fun. But let's start with the Axe Murder House. The Villisca Axe Murder House in Villisca, Iowa is a well-known tourist attraction for ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts. And it's the site of a gruesome unsolved 1912 murder where 6 children and 2 adults had their skulls completely crushed by the axe of some unknown assailant. It's really tragic stuff, and it was purchased in 1994 and restored to its original 1912 condition and converted into like a tourist trap kind of thing. Costs $428 a night to stay at the old haunted home. No, fuck no. I mean, I'm interested in paranormal shit, and I wouldn't mind, I wouldn't mind sleeping in like a paranormal hotel or like a haunted hotel or haunted house. Like, I feel like I wouldn't mind, but I'm not paying $428 a night to stay at one. Jeesh. But visitors always report really strange paranormal experiences, such as visions of a man with an axe roaming the halls, or the faint screams of children, which, fuck that. But in November of 2014, the haunting took a much darker turn. Paranormal investigator Robert Stephen Lorson Jr. who was 37-year-old from Rhinelander, Wisconsin. He was, he regularly came for these recreational paranormal visits with the house. And suddenly, his companions found him stabbed in the chest. So they call 911, and Larson is brought to this nearby hospital before being helicoptered to Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha. And the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office said that Larson had suffered a self-inflicted injury, right? So he had done it to himself, which is weird. But even weirder is that these injuries happened at 12:45 a.m., which is around the same time the 1912 axe murders in the house took place. Larson recovered from his injuries, but has never spoken publicly about what occurred that day. For Martha Lynn, the owner of the house, the incident was very upsetting. It's publicity, she said, but it's not exactly the kind of publicity you desire to have. I completely understand that. She said, I don't want people thinking that when they come to the Villisca axe murder house that something's going to happen. It's going to make them do something like that. But for now, the house remains open for tourist visits and overnight stays today. But fuck that. I wasn't even going to go originally. Like, fuck that price tag. But like now I'm definitely not going to go. Oh, shit. Our next ghost story, we will be talking about the infamous night marchers, or the Hukai-Po, on the island of Hawaii. I know I always say this, but I really do apologize for the pronunciation because Hawaiian words are hard. But like, also I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to seem like I'm just kind of like fucking like going over it and saying it in a funny voice. I really am trying to pronounce these as accurately as I think they sound. The night marchers, anyway, back to the night marchers. They are said to be the ghosts of these ancient Hawaiian warriors, and they appear on the nights honoring the Hawaiian gods Kane, Ku, Lono, or on the nights of Kanaloa. They're said to come forth from their burial sites or to rise up from the ocean and to march in a large group to these ancient Hawaiian battle sites or to the other sacred places. And they're dressed for battle in these big headdresses and these cloaks, carrying spears and clubs and beating war drums and blowing tones from conch shells and holding torches and announcing the advancing of their march. And like a lot of people have theories about what it is they're doing. Some believe they're looking to reclaim their rightful territory. Some think that they're replaying a battle that didn't go the way that it should have, avenging their own deaths. And some say that the night marchers are actually searching methodically for an entrance into the next world, like the afterlife. I've also heard some say that like they come to take people who are like close to death or nearing death. But legend also says that they're suspended in the air and their feet do not touch water or ground as they traverse through the night, and they leave no evidence of their visitations. But probably the scariest thing about the night marchers is they don't go out of their way to, hurt the living, but these spectral warriors are far, far from harmless. They march in darkness after sunset, and they march as a group continuously until just before sunrise, and it's said that any mortal that is out and about as their marching goes on must go inside immediately, lay prone on the floor, and not look up to avoid the notice of the night marchers, in fear of harm or even death. Night marchers might appear during the day if coming to escort a dying relative to the spirit world. So how do these night marchers kill you? Well, ancient Hawaiian belief states that any mortal looking upon or being seen in defiance towards the night marchers will die violently. Some people maintain that if the mortal lies motionless, face down on the ground, like I said, that they're showing proper respect to the night marcher, and that they'll be spared. But additionally, mortals can avoid harm or death from night marchers by being fortunate to have an ancient ancestor marcher present to recognize them. So if one of the night marchers is like your ancestor, and they see you, which this only really applies to like natives, but as they encounter the mortal, they will call out Nau, which means mine in Hawaiian, and no one in the warrior procession will harm them. And now our final ghost story takes us to Luanu's Canyon, more commonly referred to as Slaughterhouse Canyon. And the legend behind this terrifying tale goes like this. During the 1800s, a family lived down in the bottoms of Slaughterhouse Canyon. Times were hard, and the father would regularly leave for weeks at a time in search of food and possibly even gold. Anything to keep the family fed and clothed. And you can probably guess the first part of this tragic story. One time he left, and he never returned. Meanwhile, his wife and children were left alone in the canyon, and they slowly began to starve. As with any canyon, if you yell loud enough, the echo will eventually make its way right back to you. And as the family began to wither away, their screams of starvation would circulate all around the canyon. Eventually, the mother couldn't bear to hear her children's painful screams, and so she murdered them and took her own life. Now, visitors to Slaughterhouse Canyon have reported feeling the anguish that still permeates the air. And on some nights when the air is still and thick, it's reported that you can hear the screams of the kids and of the mother as she made the tragic decision to end their suffering. So, that one's pretty dark. So let's move on to a lighter note. I'll tell you about some ghost stories that I've had happen to me. So the first one we'll start with is kind of creepy. I remember being told this one a while back. So the day that my little brother was born, it was either the day of or around that time, my stepfather's father, my step-grandfather, passed away tragically. It was really unfortunate. But my little brother was born. And so, sadly, he didn't get to meet him. But, we had our ceremony. We had our, funeral. We said our goodbyes. And as the days go on, Brennan's growing up. Well, one thing about my stepdad's father, he always wore a pair of overalls, and he carried those old, packages of napkins and tissues with him that, you blow your nose with. You know the ones I'm talking about, the ones that are a little square. He always kept one with him. Well, one day, my mom walks into the living room, and she finds my little brother playing with a little package of tissues, right? The same kind that my grandfather would have had in his overalls. And she asked him where he got them, because, we didn't really have any around the house, to my knowledge. She asked where he got him, and he looked at her, and he said that Papa gave him to him. And he said my grandfather's name, which is weird because, well, yes, he knew of him. He had never met him in his life. So, real spooky stuff there. I still get chills telling that one. But another one that I have for you is more recent. This happened recently at my house with my wife. We were both sitting in the living room. I was sitting on the couch. My wife, Chloe, she was taking our plates from the table into the kitchen. And the way our, living room is set up is, we've got the couch. I'm laying on the couch, and I'm facing the back doors to our porch, and we have our curtains drawn, closed. There's a little sliver from where the light can come in, and the sun was just setting, so the sun's right behind our backyard, shining the light through. My wife's standing there, and she's talking to me, and suddenly I look over, and a shadow moves across the light, as if somebody had walked past our door. The problem with this is that I had been looking at our back porch, and no one was there. And the only way, from where the sun was, the only way that the light could have reflected somebody walking is if they were right on our back porch walking across our door. And I was looking right at the door when it happened, and nothing happened. Nobody walked across the door. And my wife was completely still at the time when she was saying this, so I knew it wasn't her shadow being reflected. And she saw the shadow as well, and was like, oh my God, did you see that? I was like, well, of course I fucking saw it. And to this day, me and Chloe don't have an explanation for what happened there. It was definitely unsettling, to say the least. There's all kinds of ghost stories where we live about stuff that's going on, so who knows? Could have been a ghost. But now that all of our tales, all of our stories are done, what are your thoughts? Are ghosts really taking up residence in abandoned homes and buildings? Were the people burned at the stake and hung by the neck really servants of Satan? What about the Brown family? Did TB really kill young Edward? Or was their daughter a creature of the night? Do werewolves stalk the forest at night, howling their soft, sad songs? It's not for me to say, but perhaps there's more going on than we know. And who knows? Maybe this Halloween, you'll see something that you can't quite explain. Well, everyone, that'll just about do it for my Halloween special. Boy, was this a long one. Took a lot of research on this, but I hope you guys enjoyed it if you listened all the way through. If not, it's totally fine if you just skimmed through. I only want you to listen to what you're interested in. And thanks again for all the support. I know I say it all the time, but I really do appreciate you guys listening to my stuff. Whoever you are, whether you're somebody I know from work, somebody from back home, or a new viewer. Whoever you are, just know that I appreciate you, and your support of my podcast. I know it's been quite some time since my last upload. A lot of you have been kind of trying to light a fire under my ass about that, which I'll explain everything in my next regularly scheduled episode, which just so happens to be the final episode of Season 1 of The Void Frequency. Another thing that I'll talk more about in the next episode, I've got a lot of cool stuff planned, a lot of new surprises for you guys in Season 2. But until then, thanks again so much for watching, everybody. I hope you'll have an amazing Halloween or Samhain or whatever the hell you'll be doing on the 31st. So get out there, go get some candy, go give some candy, dress up, be spooky, stay in, watch a horror movie, but above all, stay weird, everybody. Have a good one, and happy Halloween.